Hey there, welcome to the Posit Data Science Hangout. I'm Libby Heron, and this is a recording of our weekly community call that happens every Thursday at 12 p.m. US Eastern Time. If you are not joining us live, you miss out on the amazing chat that's going on. So find the link in the description where you can add our call to your calendar and come hang out with the most supportive, friendly, and funny data community you'll ever experience. Can't wait to see you there. I am so excited to introduce today our featured leader, Tan Ho, engineering manager at Teamworks Intelligent Soccer. And you might also know Tan as a person who volunteers frequently at DSLC, Data Science Learning Community, and also is a huge open source contributor. So, Tan, I would love it if you could introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about you and something you like to do for fun.
Yeah. Hey everybody. Wow, there's a lot of people in here. My name's Tan. I am based in Ottawa, Canada. I've been writing R since 2019. Um, and my background is in business, so I studied commerce as an undergrad. Then I went into my family business, and then the family business was property management, and basically hated that job. So along the way, I started doing, hobby stuff in fantasy football, and building spreadsheets, doing sports analytics, and eventually that kind of snowballed as I got more and more skilled at spreadsheets, the demand for, doing some programming to support it kind of increased. And eventually that led me to starting work on, programming and fantasy football packages and so on. And then along the way, basically, I lost my job in property management and then proceeded to find a new job as a construction data analyst. And that has since snowballed into a position with Zealous, which is now called, was acquired by a company called Teamworks. And now I work professionally in soccer analytics. So that's the quick rundown. And you asked about something fun I like to do. Definitely this time of year is prime pumpkin carving season, and I am starting to kind of figure out what pumpkins I want to carve this year. Generally, I try to carve at least one. I think this year I want to try for two, and I haven't really figured out what those things are going to be yet, but I have a couple ideas, so we'll definitely take some suggestions if you have any.
Yeah. And also, if you happen to have carved pumpkin pictures right now that you would like to put in the chat for my enjoyment, I would love them. I absolutely love pumpkin carving. I put a link to Tan's pumpkin carving website. Like, I'm going to put it in there just right now again in case anybody missed it that first time. Go take a look at Tan's pumpkins. They are amazing. Um, Even though I have a very bad track record with recognizing what they are when they're tiny on a screen. Okay, let's dig in just a little bit more with that background because I want everybody to understand just how amazing it is that you started somewhere that you hated, doing something that you didn't like to do, a previous life, shall we say, to data science, and you built something in Excel with like Power Query and stuff, right? Not even in R. You did not know R. You did not know Shiny. You built it and you got so much of a following on Reddit and so many people using your thing that you were like, we need to scale this up, right? How amazing is it that that's how you learned R?
Yeah,
Tell
it's
us just like a
crazy.
snippet of that.
Yeah, it's really crazy because like I didn't have any programming by trade, right? So I went to business school. I was good at Excel, but I was really wasn't really sure what I want to do with myself aside from that. And so I started, essentially like trying to connect to APIs through Power Query. So that's the Power BI like querying like data manipulation language. And that was kind of my gateway drug into like some of the programming stuff because, at this point I had like I want to say like over 20 fantasy leagues, and to try to analyze all of them basically just needed scale, right? And so as soon as you get one league, you can just, do it manually. But when you get to 20, you're like, okay, now you're a programmer. And so I put that all together, put it on Reddit, and people started asking me like, "Hey, can you make me a sheet just like this?" And it works fine the first one, two times, but Power Query at that time was basically just on Excel for Windows, and so um, it was kind of challenging because there wasn't a Mac version of this, or wasn't available on mobile or whatever, right? And so um, built enough of a following. And so one of my friends, Joe Sadlowski, who I also happened to meet on Reddit through a fantasy league, um, basically just offered to write me a Shiny app. He was learning R in school, and so he learned R and a little bit of Shiny at the time, and he wrote the very first version of the Shiny app. And so at this point, he basically built a front end that hooked into my backend app, like my backend, like spreadsheets and data pulls and so on, and put it on the internet. And it basically exploded. And he was a grad student at the time. I was, working on, um, as a property manager, is just doing stuff as a hobby, but still doing this mostly with Excel. And so he couldn't keep up with essentially feature requests. And I was like, well, dude, like this thing's broken. It needs to do this, it needs to do that. And I just became that really pesky project manager. And so that one day he just gave up and was
Do it
like,
yourself.
just go do it yourself, right? And it's like, okay, sure. Where do I do? What do I do? And so my very first experience with R was basically like bug fixing and editing the Shiny app, and didn't use tidyverse. It didn't use, it just used Shiny. And it was like this awful base R thing. And he'll forgive me for saying this because we're both, whatever. But I basically like taught myself with this app, with it, I needed to do this, and taught myself Shiny first, and then I taught myself tidyverse. And then basically rewrote the whole app eventually to use tidyverse and like to build like this data pipeline that went with it. And that was our first big app. And so my gateway drug to R was a Shiny app that did fantasy football. And then after that, I um,
Wait, wait, wait.
started expanding from there.
Important point. How many users did you have? Because I have worked on apps professionally that have had like 7 users if I'm lucky.
Yeah, I mean, I think it got hot to death basically immediately when we put it out,
Right.
and that's like Joe's
How
first
many
version.
thousands of users, Tan?
And so at its peak, I think it hit 200,000 monthly users on the Shiny app itself, which was
Yep.
spread over, I think, 3 app instances at that time. And so that's like with Google Analytics monthly users. But when people talk about Shiny not scaling, I laugh because I have firsthand experience running an app out of my garage, essentially, uh, with hundreds of thousands of users and like pictures to
Yeah.
prove it and everything. And
Yeah.
to
And
this day, it's like a
there's
hundred
a,
thousand users. Yeah.
there's a lot a
So
lot of like faces in our my grid of people that was like, oh my gosh, that's amazing.
yeah, yeah.
And I got a little, 7 users. Libby, I've been there. Yeah. I mean, I think that getting people to use something that you built at a business that's like a dashboard or something is really, really hard. I'm going to put a link in the chat here. Everybody go save this talk for later so you can watch it and get a more in-depth view of what Tan's talking about, this Shiny app that was serving 100,000 monthly users. Okay. Eric, you had a question. Eric Nance, who is another open source R hero. Would you like to ask that live?
Sure. And for those that may not know, Tan and I go pretty far back, and he is largely responsible for me getting that live streaming bug. So it's all your fault, but no, all good. But my question is, obviously I've been a huge fan of the open source work you've done, especially around sports analytics. Your contributions to the NFLverse, even though I'm not a football fan primarily, I love the tooling around it. Just curious, especially for those that may be wondering, just this out loud, so to speak. How did the techniques and maybe skills you learned in crafting a lot of the tooling behind NFLverse help translate to when you actually were able to get a new role, as you mentioned, developing these sophisticated R tools or programs? What kind of techniques and ideas did you learn from your open source work that have directly benefited in your professional day to day.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because like nothing I can do. So I work mostly on internal tools, and I think a lot of people will share this experience as our production engineers essentially, is that your user base, especially with Shiny apps, but even just pipelines and stuff, is mostly internal. But I think all of the things that I learned working on Dynasty Process, I use today, like every day, right? Like all of the stuff, learning to run your own server, how do you scale things, how do you, like obviously like performance, like I write fast code because I had to, right? Like I have to write code that serves that many people. But I think the other thing that it really taught me was just the interface part, like getting people to adopt your use. Like I think the parts about the packages are very interesting because I'm on a team now of essentially 10 R coders essentially. And I think all of the stuff that NFLverse and open source packages have taught me is to really think about the way you design that interface, trying to allow them to basically go through and do whatever it is they need to do. It's part of the like building the tooling and coming at it as like a tools process is part of that, right? Because I think the temptation from if you only write analysis for yourself is, you write it basically like you write what you need right then. And I almost by default now will write, okay, well, what's the like building blocks that make sense for this general process? And so coming at it a little more procedurally, a little more like what's the interface going to be, whether that's an app, whether that's a package, whether that's or what like, what are the user stories, what are the expectations? Um, that's sort of the main takeaway that I think across the board. Obviously, like the process of design packages also, the branding helped me get the job and all that kind of stuff. But I think as a whole, that would be that like yeah, I would probably point back to the idea. The main idea is basically like, thinking through user interface story, how they're going to work with your work, kind of thing.
I think also it's really important to point out just how much Tan worked out loud. So you started coding in R or learning R in 2019, I think. And then during the pandemic, you started Twitch streaming your coding, which means
Yeah,
that you were working out loud very early, like probably before you felt like you were a confident coder. Do you feel like that had a big part to play in your confidence level in your, building a personal brand, being recognized?
definitely. And I think like the streaming has paid off in a whole bunch of ways, but I think the number one way is just like this ability to kind of talk through when you get stuck on things or, pair program through like when you run into a bug, there's no panic, especially like if something's broken, it's often quickest to just think through what the problem is and solve that thing. And I've definitely found it useful. Like the streaming for sure was a big part of that. And I also do it, asynchronously in, forum questions and try to think through other people's questions and, help build those mental models and so on. The branding part for sure. I think part of that, like I think the part with the 100,000 users and whatever, I think like that's a different set of people, right? Like those are people who are mostly interested in the fantasy football, but definitely the packages work. Um, Working out loud, building public tools, that was a lot of what I would say like built towards the like public coding reputation and trying to be approachable, trying to pay all of that forward is one of those like big motivators that I think has just had a ton of benefits every time you turn around. Sure.
Yeah.
So,
Do it. Work out loud, everybody.
yeah,
Be
absolutely.
brave. We're such a fun and supportive community that I really encourage you to do it. And we're going to have a friend of Tan's on very soon, the beginning of November, Ariel Drawer, who also very heavily worked out loud. And within like 6 months of working out loud, had a job herself working in soccer analytics. So lots of success stories for working out loud. And if you would like to get a start, share something on Blue Sky. Blue Sky is a really great place in the RStats and Data BS communities. Well, I wanted to bring in some questions from Slido. Don't forget, you can ask questions on Slido, everybody. And we had an anonymous question that was, what is your top advice for data scientists who want to get better about thinking about code in production specifically? Or do you have any resources that you use to help you learn about code in production?
That's a great question. I think like the part about coding in production, and I think it's hard for like data scientists sometimes because it's hard to visualize what production is, right? And so the way I like to think about production is, you have an analysis, it becomes something in production when someone uses it to make a decision. Um, and so if you put that analysis into someone's hands and they're looking at it and doing something with that based on what they're reading from you, that becomes production. If you're just writing, um, if you just put a plot for it being pretty or for, communicating something, the moment someone reads it and thinks that they need to go do something, that is the start of the production pipeline, if you will. And so then it's like, okay, well, they made that decision once, but they won't probably want to do that repeatedly. So then, thinking about the reproducibility and, pipeline and consistency. But I think in general, everything that influences somebody to make a decision from your analysis is production. And so moving that, I want to call it a goalpost. I'm going to have to make a lot of sport references. I'm sorry in advance. But moving the goalpost from this mythical, like code in production is an app, it's a report, it's a no code in like the data science part that when it is in production is when someone reads it and makes a decision from that. And so hold yourself to standards for production level thing if they're going to do something with your code. If you're just writing it for fun, if it's, a my very first package, pseudo package essentially was like a dad joke API app or whatever, right? That's not production. Then I was going to make a decision from that. That would be something I would consider a toy. But if someone was going to do something with my data viz, with my report, with my analysis, that's production. And so anytime you get into something that's going to do that, don't take like that's when you need to like hold yourself to whatever your standard of production is. And then, that those standards will grow, the competencies will grow as you work through that process. So like my definition of what production quality is might be different than yours, might be different than any other person, but when to apply that standard is sort of my like thing that I think people should do more of, which is like anytime someone does a decision, you should do that. So that's when you need to put it in a package. That's when you need to write functions. That's when you need to document. That's when you need to leave it notes for yourself, right? Like all of those things. The moment someone makes a decision with it, that's production. So hold
Yeah,
yourself to production standards at that point.
I feel like that's good advice for anybody thinking about anything, because a lot of times the thing that you start on that you're not thinking about is going to be in production might end up being in production. And I've worked for a lot of companies where they have tools that are sort of like glued together with spit because 20 years ago somebody built it on the side and now it is a production thing because like oops, that was really helpful, now we're just going to use it, and it wasn't really ready to be a production tool yet, right? So it
And a
might seem
prototype,
like
if like survives, like if you label it a prototype, you've just cursed it to being used 20 years from
right.
now, basically.
Yeah.
Right.
Rachel
So
even gives me this advice when I set events up in Zoom. She's like, don't set them up as a pretend one. Set it up as the thing because it's probably going to become the thing, which is a
always.
really, really good piece of advice. Well, I also wanted to share in the chat the book Show Your Work by Austin Kleon because, Tan, this is something that you mentioned to me. And you're not the only one. I think that Cara Thompson also mentioned this book to me. And it's one that's been on my to read list for a while. So if anybody else has read it, let me know. Oh my gosh, Tim just shared so many pumpkins in the chat. Everybody go check out pumpkins in the chat.
I love
Thank
Show
you.
Your Work. I have it like right next to me, like all the time, and it is literally the world's smallest like book, if you can
It's
see it here.
little. Yeah, it's very
And
cute.
the font size is huge and has pictures. So
Not a
totally
hard
like
read.
super, it's like super quick read, but I think it's really good for like the marketing and like really what I would consider like authentic self-promotion marketing is that like you want to demonstrate, you know, I'm a person. I think through things. I am, you make yourself more relatable by working through things in production, like in working out loud. Sorry, got production on my brain. Um, and like it's super good inspiration for just go out and do more stuff, right? Like I wouldn't be where I am without um having worked in public on this, on Twitter, on Slack, on whatever, right? So most of those things are all um, you know, because I work out loud for sure.
Yeah. I mean, same. All right. We have a question from Noor in the Slido. Noor, would you like to unmute and ask your question live? And I want you, Noor, to direct this to everybody as well. I think we could all share some resources here. And Eric had already shared one in a reply as well. Thank you, Eric. I'll put that in the chat too.
Hello, Tan. So before I crack out, I know of one book, Mastering Shiny, but do you have any other good references or resources for people who are starting their Shiny journey? Or is it just sort of like build something, break something, learn from this, maybe do the next one better? And this
Yeah,
is to
I
everyone,
am.
so.
Yeah, I definitely those resources didn't exist. Mastering Shiny is an awesome resource. Um, I think I am a person who learns by projects and helping people like answer questions. Those are kind of the two main things that I like think through. I'm very like very like case study situational type stuff. I'm bad at textbooks. I am not very good at those kinds of things, but I know there are a bunch of good resources. I think, Mastering Shiny is probably the book that gets you from 0 to 80 these days. And then from there, you basically start getting more advanced at things. There's a great book by David Grandjohn, who's basically god of R of Shiny UX and UI, called I think it's Outstanding User Interfaces. Um, and I have read that. I peruse it every now and then. I think that's like a super useful way to think about those things. Um, the back end stuff, I think like actually, there's probably my thing about the Shiny backend is that actually people are overcomplicating it in most cases. Um, I think that your backend should be less complicated, move that stuff into a package is my like main thesis there. So I would encourage people to go into our packages next, actually, in terms of like production, like, putting Shiny apps in prod. Um, those are kind of the two places that I go to most. I think, I advise working on projects, learning something, figuring out what you need at that moment, and then also just like going around and looking at other apps and other websites, right? Like I think like if you put yourself into that user brain, I think that like that'll teach you a lot of like, design type stuff. Like people will sometimes ask, like, how do you be a good like app designer? I'm a terrible one, but like I think like the ideas are like there are a lot of people working on really good stuff. How do you emulate this point click information, that kind of thing? So those are
Right.
kind of the main things I think about for sure.
Yeah, and I think that volunteering can also help. Like if you have a buddy who's working on a Shiny app, volunteer to work on it with them. You might learn things. Like I didn't learn modularization in Shiny apps until I was working on one for the first time. And I was like, I guess I'm going to learn modules now because I have to do them. I think that the working out loud part can be with buddies. It doesn't have to be alone. You can do it with friends. I think Ariel is going to be a good example of that on her Hangout as well, where the community is like a feedback mechanism, right? Like you do something, you get feedback about it, you get to iterate on it. And you mentioned going into packages next as the sort of bit of advice. And I know that Travis had asked in the chat, like, well, what's the trigger point where you decide to bundle several packages or products into one thing? Like NFLverse is now a lot of things, kind of like Tidyverse is a lot of things. Um, how big did it get before you decided to put everything in one?
I start with everything as a package now. I find that like it's a little bit like everyone is. I think this will sometimes seem like dogma, where I think like you'll see people tell you like just start everything as a package. But there's a couple compelling reasons for me that like everything as a package is just the right way to think about things. Um, One of them is that you can like there's like a bunch of resourcing built around packages, right? A package is a collection of functions to me. And so as soon as you have more than one function, you have a package, in my opinion. And so you can just put that right away. Um, the the definition of package being just it's a collection of functions also means that like that's when you can start thinking about how do I test this? How do I document this as a function? How does someone use this code, right? Um, People think about like it needs to meet all of the CRAN bar of like standards, which I don't agree with. I think like a package can be just, a collection of functions with documentation and maybe tests, and that's about it. But like, when should it be a package? From the start is really my answer, and I'm very much on that,
I
train
like
as
that.
with a bunch of people. So
I've noticed that as a trend in my friends who are Shiny developers over the years have moved further and further towards every Shiny app is a package, and everything I do is now a package. And anytime I write something that's more than one function, it's a package because your documentation is bundled in with it, and it forces you to write the documentation for the stuff,
yeah.
the descriptions and everything. And I think that that's a really, really great benefit of going the package route. Okay, we had a question from Hubert in Slido. Hubert, would you like to ask your question live? Hubert Hickman.
Yep, I will. So my questions were, you said that the number of users you have, and immediately got a headache just thinking about it. But what were the biggest hurdles you faced in getting the app to run successfully with that user load? And how much did the characteristics of that user base drive this? And is your user base, was it primarily, are they in and out, or do they stay in the app using it a long time? How did that shape how you tuned and made the thing work?
Yeah, and so the most popular app is essentially a trade calculator. And so, as a brief explanation of fantasy football, you basically, you get players on your team and you get points from them doing things on the field. And so each person in a league will have players, and a lot of what the most successful app is basically just I want to trade this player for that player and this other player, is this fair? And so the individual requests are was quite quick, right? Like some of the math stuff behind it, I could pre-calculate and all of that stuff. And so the initial, like each user session is quite short, and their interactions make for very small request turnaround times. But some thoughts around that essentially are like moving as much of the logic out of the app as possible. If you can pre-compute it, great. If you can, cache common requests, that's great. If you can, um, simplify the interface or reduce the interface that serves the thing so that like they only really get to play with like a limited set of things, then like you do a little less, but you do that thing really well. And then the other part is like if you can speed up the actual query, so rewrote it in data table, for instance, that scales quickly. And so Shiny is really good at like it's easy to it's the reputation about scaling definitely is partially like how long is the session. So the average session is like 30 seconds or a minute or whatever. They get the answer and then move on kind of thing. Um, but like once if the app is not doing any thinking, it can serve a lot of users really well, right? Like it's not when everybody's idle or roughly idle, it's not that huge a pain to have everybody opening the app at once. It's how many simultaneous calculations can you have at once? And so then, that's where you get into promises or, horizontal scaling and like, pushing everybody to different instances of that app. But as a general thing, like, yeah, it's the reason why it's so successful is because it's small and does a very short calculation that returns a thing. And that's like the main like performance consideration is like making each user's like round trip very, very small.
I love it.
Within that.
This is also something that you mentioned in your Shiny in production talk, which is like don't have it do a bunch of stuff. You're making Shiny do too much. You could have that all happening somewhere else, and Shiny could just be doing the stuff that's serving the people the thing. I think that's fantastic advice. And I think we had a specific fantasy football question. Who was it? Joe Harder, you would ask this. Would you like to hop in and ask that live?
Yeah, sure. I don't trust myself, so when ESPN says projected points are whatever for this coming week, I just say, okay, then I just go with the top one. But have you found that you can do better? And like how can maybe I do a better job of evaluating players?
Yeah, I think that like the humility part of it is actually very accurate, right? So I think if you think that you're not smarter than the crowd, you tend to do better than if go off on your own, which is actually kind of a counterintuitive thing to think. Um, so I tend to pick lineups and stuff like that based on like consensus rankings, Fantasy Pros, ADP, that kind of thing. Um, and do a lot of my own modeling just based on like rankings, actually, more so than like individual features. I think there's a lot of noise in that space. And so if you can lean on wisdom of crowds, I think that's generally going to end up with a slightly better output than like ESPN, which you don't really know like what is going into that, right? So some computer thing that might be waiting, whatever. But to me, I think like wisdom of crowds is most of where I would go for fantasy stuff.
All right, awesome. Joe, thank you for asking. David, you had a question. David Gearhartz. Would you like to ask that live?
If I can unmute. Yep, okay.
There he is. Hey.
I got excited when you talked about writing fast code. So I'm curious about your experience with any particular packages that you found most helpful, and if you have any insights into pros and cons with respect to like just time the whole project versus timing specific snippets of code. Yeah, any insights you have?
Yeah, in general, when you're interested in code timings, you either approach it from inside, like is it like a single function, or you approach it from like the code performance in the bigger system. And so the techniques I use the most is like the bench package to benchmark something, specifically like that set of things. And that's good too because it also gives you a nice like sort of estimate of the like memory usage. And it like will like run multiple iterations of the code rather than just once. So the bench package is my go-to for like timing a single function. And then actually like I just use log messages most of the time with time stuff for like bigger systems. I think that like it's hard to get a sense of where something is slow. So if you stick a bunch of log messages in, I'm excited about the new open telemetry stuff that Barrett Schlarke's working on. I'm sorry for butchering the last name there. But that's a similar thing where you're basically logging like code block timing. Those are kind of the two things that I use the most. But in general, like I don't really optimize something until I see that I need to. And so that's where like I start with logging and would be keen to try OpenTelemetry for sure for that kind of stuff. And then once I get into that, I can sort of identify where I should spend time to make things go faster.
Awesome. The making things go faster thing is my downfall. I tend to write stuff that just works and then hope that somebody else is going to help me make it faster. Thank you, David, for asking that question. And there was one that I liked that was about the refining process. It was an anonymous question, and it said, do you start with use case first and then scale, or generic code and then refine? And I'm guessing that this is about your initial development process.
Yeah, generally use case first. I'm a kind of person who will, for Shiny apps especially, I will wireframe them out on a TL draw or Lucidchart or something like that first, Figma now, um, and then hook things into it after. But even for packages, like, you know, I have a rough sense of like how I think people will use it, and then, um, you know, start with those building blocks first. Some people are test-driven development. That's sort of the same idea. You write the test first because the test is the use case, right? Like you can do that. I know my friend John Harmon would say something about vignette-driven development, which is the same idea. It's a similar idea about like what's the use case, like draw out the story and then build the functions that support that use case. Definitely that is how I would think about it, because sometimes you can start at too generic, you can start at too high a level or too low a level. So I would definitely start with use cases and user stories, for sure.
Dan Chen says conference-driven development.
Yes, yeah. If you have to present it at a conference, that is very much a use case, like, shoving it in front of N people, explaining why code is always
Yeah.
like the first step for sure. So
Sometimes that's why working out loud is helpful, because you know that other people are going to look at it and you're like, all right, well, I'm going to on purpose give this to other people to look at it, and it kind of forces you to clean up some stuff and organize some stuff a little bit better. Okay,
yeah,
thank you so
absolutely.
much, Anonymous Asker, for that one. Dharakshan, you had a question in Slido. Would you like to ask that one? It was a soft skills question.
Hi, I hope everyone is doing great. Hi, everyone. Okay, so my question is, as you yourself is a self-taught programmer, so I'm not going to directly ask about data and stuff. I'm going to ask about the soft skill part, like personality trait, like how right now you manage issues or bugs or break-in pipelines, etc., as compared to when you first started, like, or any personality trait you adopted during this journey that make you more uh, I can say efficient in handling these as compared to when you first started learning coding and stuff. So yeah.
I like
That's
this.
an interesting question.
It was almost like, how did you grow as a person through this, Dan?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think like I think I don't think I'm that different from a traits perspective. I think the things that have helped me the most, um, I I mean, part of this is like ADHD-ness, but like this like curiosity and wanting to understand the whole thing. Like I want to go deep on basically everything. And I think like what that actually is, as I kind of learn more about programming, is this idea that um, mental models are everything. And really fleshing those out takes a lot of persistence, curiosity, willing to help, right? Like a huge part of like building out that skill set is just lurking the DSLC forums and or help channels and trying to get through everything just to kind of test my own mental model, right? Like some of like part of the like things around like answering questions and being helpful and paying it forward. Some of it is like motivation of the motivated by helping people, but I'll admit to being really selfish about some of these things is in that it helps me really like test depth of knowledge and really if I can like understand the problem and explain that mental model, um, it really kind of strengthens your own learnings in a really good way. And so, very curious, very, driven to understand something to a lot of depth. Those are kind of like some of my some of the things that I think are the most useful from a self-teaching perspective is just like go through, build mental models, understand the relationships between things, why things work the way they work. And it's actually one of the things that like LLMs concerns me the most about is that like people are less likely to develop strong mental models if they, part of their mental model becomes use LLM to understand why this thing is and then just ask LLM and then come back, right? That's one of my actually biggest concerns about that and the loss of the critical thinking, curiosity parts. But, patience, I think that that's definitely a, and like lack of shame, right? Like we've talked about the like learning in public and live streaming. Um, those things I think are also useful. Not specifically about the self-taught like part, perhaps, but I think that those skills and soft skills are great for more for an advancement side of things, perhaps, or um, calmly approaching bugs, sure. But also having faith in yourself that you can solve basically everything. You solved a lot of hard bugs before, and you can solve anything that you try to.
I like that a lot. Have confidence in yourself. You have a track record of getting through a lot of bugs. You'll probably get through this one. Um, Thank you so much for asking that question, Direction. I love it. And we have a few more questions that I bet we can get in our 12 minutes that we have left. And one of them is a follow-on to this. So I'm going to ask it. It's an anonymous question that says, you mentioned curiosity and going in depth. Did you have instances when you felt you were going overboard and had to pull back a little? And as somebody who over-engineers, I can relate.
I think that there's always like how curious, like I think if you are still feeling curious about something, it is perfectly fine to keep going, in my opinion. It is, I try to draw lines around when I find it detrimental in the sense that like I really don't understand, or I'm really stuck, or whatever. Like I think that sort of lines where like the frustration line is kind of one that I monitor a little bit, where like if I'm too frustrated to solve this thing, I need to take a break. That's sort of like, when I want to pull back. Or, what is the like trying to weigh it against like engineering optimal versus like what is the 80% line. Um, so to the this is also from John, introduced me to this talk, but or this video, but a project is like one golden rule for like this sort of thing is always ship a project when you think it's like 80% done and then take a break from that project. So like there is like this thing that people always want to make it perfect to do this thing, but when it's at 80% of as good as you think it could be based on where you are now and all your skills, ship it. And then, if it's really, really, really um something you want to come back to, you'll find the time after you take that break and like you'll come back to it and like users will drive you back to this thing. But always, 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 always ship it, especially at the 80% mark, because that last 20% is going to take 80% more work, essentially. Right. So like the 80-20 rule of like shipping things is like always ship it at 80% and then don't go back to it for a long time, essentially. And that's been super helpful to also stop me from going overboard on how deep things to go.
Yeah, I like that. I tend to allow myself to get caught up in the pressure of needing to go fast. So I stop myself from following my curiosity into the like rabbit holes that it wants to go into. And I feel like in the long term, overall, that makes things worse for me because then I'm like, okay, I'm going to look for a shortcut to solve my problem instead of learning these parts and pieces more deeply so that I understand them on a functional level, foundational level, and how they fit together. It's like if you go and you try to understand modules in Shiny and you're like, I'm just going to try to skim this, you're going to end up writing terrible Shiny code and it's going to be really frustrating and modules are really going to frustrate you. But if you took the time to really, really in depth learn modules and understand both modules and Shiny and whatever your subject is that you're building your app around, you're going to have a better time overall not taking the shortcut. So I think that's my 2 cents on that one. Thank you for asking that question, Anonymous Asker. I appreciate it. Edward, I saw you had asked a question in Slido as well. Would you like to unmute and ask that live?
Yeah, hey, I'm unmuted.
Hey.
Cool. So my question was just after you've built a prototype and you need to move something that's like more robust for production, what design ideas and tools are the most important for making sure your workflow is reproducible and debuggable, especially when you're working or handing off a project to teammates with no software engineering background? I work in public policy, and I'm like the only one on my team that has a background in software engineering. And like to the point where like object-oriented programming is like was an unheard thing of when I showed up. So this question is just like, what can I do to as best practices for the rest of the team?
It's a great question. In general, I think that if you're handing a software, like are you talking about handing an app off to a entirely non-technical team? Because I think that's a slightly different situation than handing it off to technical users who are not as technical as you, right? So I think that's actually two different things almost, because if you're handing it to a non-technical team, you want basically you want to give them something like a Shiny app or like a Poly, like you only want to give them the quarto output or the markdown output and not the actual app, or not the app's code, right? And so to me, that means you need to have it deployed somewhere and you should hand it off there and, have a feedback form, a Google form link to collect feedback on the thing, and have a way for them to communicate thoughts around that prototype. They're going to run into bugs, and so logging is more important in that case because they're probably not going to be able to like reproduce. Like they're not going to hand you a reprex. They're going to be like, I did this thing and it broke. And so to me, like when you hand it off entirely non-technical, that's sort of my like lines of thought is that there's the polish required from you is a little higher, and you're going to need to guard against like you're going to need to find ways to collect their feedback that are non-code oriented. As far as like less technical teammates who are still coding, I think that's where like setting production standards become a little bit of a thing, and being good at templating, being good at having tests, and I Dockerize everything. And so if you have those things structured and as many guardrails as you can set up, that doesn't mean that they need to understand those things in order to like work with the code, but I think having more guardrails and supporting their development as technical coders becomes more important than more so than the polished layers of like the app kind of thing. If you're going to hand a production script, right, like that's sort of more important to have those tests and things in place, and containerized and the deployment parts handled kind of thing, rather than like a Google form or something like that. So
Nice.
that covered.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Edward, for asking that question. And thanks, Tan, for the answer. And now, with our 5 minutes left, I would love to ask you the question we try to ask everybody, which is, do you have a piece of career advice that you either have followed and has done you well, or that you like to give others?
We talked about sharing your work. We talked about working in public. I think the one that we haven't already touched on yet, I'd say, is making friends. I think make friends in your communities, make nerdy friends, talk to people, talk about the things you're interested in, talk with people doing the work that you're interested in, understand like sort of how they think, make friends. Doesn't have to be friends. You don't have to be friends with people who are like massively further ahead of you, but I think like making friends with your peers who are looking in this space, being open and sharing your work and, sharing memes, and those connections matter more than, and like when I say making friends, people go like, when I say making friends, and I don't say networking for a reason, right? Like a few really good friends are going to be way more than, a LinkedIn button acquaintance kind of thing. So to me, like make friends in the spaces you care about. They, will tell you to, go fix the dang app yourself and, do those things for you that like you can't force, I think, in like a network, in like a more, overt networking way. Like I think if you think about networking as go make nerdy friends, um, having a few really good nerdy friends will take you so much further and in that space than in any other way. In
I
terms of like
agree.
growing a career.
I agree so much that I gave a talk called Why You Should Stop Networking and Start Making Friends. So I'm gonna shameless plug for that one. It's very short. But I wholeheartedly agree. And I really hope that if you are not on the data science Discord server that Posit that Posit runs, that I help run for Posit, you should definitely get there. And I'm going to share a link so that everybody can hop on there if they would like to. I'll get that in 1 second here. But I wanted to make sure that I said, Tan, you really have to go add your dad jokes generator to the Only the Silliest Projects channel on that Discord server because Dami Pack requested a channel for only silly projects. And it has been a joy to go through and look at the stuff, and especially the stuff that Dami puts up is just so, so, so fun. She's not here today, but go find her on the server and look at her silly projects. She just wrote something that was like a model that would let her predict when that Lou Bega song came out based on the names of the women and like when their names were popular baby names, which cracks me up. Mambo number 5, thank you, Rachel. I'm like the Lou Bega song. It is so freaking funny. So go check out Only Silliest Projects. Check out what Dami's doing. Put your own silly projects there. Say hello to Tan, who was there on that server with me. And I really, can't wait to see you. Also, if you get on there in the Discord server, I only know your name from Zoom as your real name. So if you get on and you have a username, consider changing it to your real name so I know who you are and say hello to me. And if you come from Data Science Hangout and you are in the server, tag me in the Data Science Hangout channel and I can make your name yellow as part of the DS Hangout crew. I'll be making Tan's name yellow in just a minute because he's now a data science alumni. All right. Thank you so much, Tan, for joining me. This was really fun. I really appreciated you hanging out with us. I hope you had a good time.
Thank you. It was awesome. Super glad to be on.
Wonderful. Everybody, I cannot wait to see you next week. We have Duty Roy, Head of Clinical Data Science Capability Management at Boehringer Ingelheim Pharmaceuticals. That's going to be a great time. I really, really hope that you will consider working out loud. Consider making some friends. Consider sharing projects, sharing code, sharing your mess, and being brave. I'm very proud of all of you for being an amazing community. If you would like to save the chat, because there's a bunch of cool stuff in there, there's 3 dots to the top right corner of your chat screen, and you can save the chat there. This will end up on YouTube in a couple of weeks, and all these resources will also be linked in the YouTube video. But you can also ask for resources in the Discord server, and we will share them there too, okay? Thank you for hanging out with us. We'll see you next week, everybody. Have a good one.